My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm 58 years old, and for most of my life I believed that respect was something you earned once and carried forever. I was raised to think that if you worked hard, kept your word, and stayed out of unnecessary conflict, people would eventually see your value. That belief held true for decades, until my daughter married a man who saw my silence not as strength, but as permission to erase me. I'm telling this story myself because for too long, others spoke about me while assuming I had nothing worth saying. This is not a story of rage or shouting matches. It's the slow, quiet account of how I was reduced to nobody in my own family and how the truth, once exposed, dismantled everything my son-in-law built on arrogance and lies. I didn't come from money. I came from discipline. I spent over 35 years working in commercial logistics and property operations, a field where success doesn't come from flash but from patience, timing, and understanding how systems actually work. I learned early that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. By my early 50s, I was comfortable, stable, and intentionally understated. I owned assets quietly, consulted selectively, and lived modestly. I didn't feel the need to impress anyone, especially not my own family. My pride wasn't in what I owned, but in the life I had rebuilt after losing my wife and raising my daughter alone through grief, adolescence, and adulthood. My daughter, Emily, was everything to me. When she introduced me to the man she was dating, Ryan, I felt that familiar parental instinct tighten in my chest. Not fear, not anger, just awareness. Ryan was polished, articulate, and confident in a way that leaned slightly too hard into performance. He talked about money constantly, but never specifics. He talked about influence, but always in vague terms. Still, Emily was happy, and I had promised myself I would never become the kind of father who poisoned love with suspicion. So I welcomed him, I shook his hand, I listened more than I spoke. That was my first mistake in his eyes from the beginning. Ryan treated me politely but distantly, like someone you tolerate rather than respect. He never asked about my work, never followed up on anything I mentioned, and often redirected conversations back to himself. At first, I thought it was nerves or immaturity, but then the small comments began. Jokes about my old school mindset. Casual remarks about how times had changed and how my generation wouldn't get it. Each comment was delivered with a smile, just harmless enough to avoid confrontation, and every time I let it pass. I thought restraint was dignity. I didn't yet understand it was being misread as irrelevance after Emily and Ryan married. The shift became unmistakable. Invitations became conditional. Decisions were made without my input. When I visited their home, Ryan controlled the room, interrupting, correcting, subtly diminishing anything I said that didn't align with his narrative. He spoke about finances with authority, while framing me as someone who had settled into retirement, even though I was still actively working. The truth didn't matter to him, the image did. He wanted me small because it made him feel larger. The moment that crystallized everything happened at a dinner with Ryan's colleagues. In front of people who didn't know me, he introduced me as Emily's father. He keeps busy these days, nothing too serious. The table laughed politely. Emily smiled uncomfortably. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, but clarity. In that moment, I understood that Ryan had rewritten my identity to suit his ego. He had reduced me to background noise. And once someone believes you are nothing, they treat you accordingly. What Ryan never realized was that my silence wasn't confusion, it was observation. I noticed how often his stories didn't align. I noticed inconsistencies in his business claims, the way he avoided specifics, the way he borrowed credibility rather than earning it. I noticed how Emily began repeating his phrases, his dismissals, his assumptions about me, and still I said nothing. Because I knew something Ryan didn't. People who underestimate you rarely protect themselves from you. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't scheme or plot. I simply stopped correcting the false image Ryan had built of me. I let him believe I was harmless. I let him believe I had no leverage, no awareness, no relevance. And quietly, patiently, I began paying attention to documents, to timelines, to financial decisions he assumed no one older could understand. The truth was already unraveling. I just needed to let it finish falling apart on its own. That was how it began. Not with confrontation, not with threats, but with a man mistaking humility for weakness and another man deciding calmly that he would no longer be erased. After that dinner, something inside me settled into a strange kind of calm, not peace calm. The kind that comes when confusion finally gives way to understanding. I stopped asking myself why Ryan treated me the way he did and started asking a much more useful question: how? How did he build his confidence so easily? How did he control rooms with half-truths? How did he manage to speak so boldly about success while keeping everything just vague enough that no one could verify it? I realized then that Ryan didn't succeed by being brilliant, he succeeded by being believed. And belief, I knew from decades in business, is fragile when it isn't backed by substance. I also began to notice changes in Emily. They were subtle, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. She hesitated before sharing things with me. She filtered her words. She'd say things like, "Ryan thinks it's better if we handle this ourselves," or "Ryan says you shouldn't worry about this." It wasn't cruelty, it was conditioning. Slowly, gently, Ryan had positioned himself as the authority and me as the outdated voice from another era. And the most painful part was that Emily didn't even realize it was happening. She thought she was protecting harmony, when in reality she was being taught who mattered and who didn't. I didn't confront her. I never challenged Ryan in front of her. I knew that would only confirm the narrative he was building, that I was stubborn, resistant, unwilling to accept my place. Instead, I stayed consistent. I showed up when invited. I stayed quiet when dismissed. I listened more than I spoke. And behind the scenes, I did what I had always done best. I observed patterns. Ryan loved talking about investments. Not details, outcomes. Profits, growth, expansion. He loved the image of being a provider, a strategist, a man in control. What he didn't love was paperwork. He skimmed contracts. He delegated compliance. He trusted that no one around him understood the structures he was operating within. He especially trusted that I didn't. That assumption became his blind spot. Through casual conversation, I learned he had recently entered into a partnership involving commercial property leveraged heavily, structured aggressively. He bragged about scale, about risk, about playing in a different league now. What he didn't realize was that I had spent years working with similar structures, watching confident men collapse under the weight of their own shortcuts. I didn't need access to his documents. I didn't need insider information. All I needed was time, and Ryan was generous with it. Then came the first crack. Emily called me late one evening, her voice tight with worry. Ryan was stressed, she said. Something about a deal not closing on time. Lenders asking questions. It's probably nothing, she added quickly, as if repeating something she'd been told. I listened. I reassured her. I told her stress happens. And after we hung up, I wrote everything down, dates, names, terms she casually mentioned without understanding their significance. I wasn't building a case, I was building context. A few weeks later, Ryan crossed a line he didn't even realize existed. At a family gathering, he openly joked about how he had taken over the role of provider and how it must be nice not having that pressure anymore at my age. The room laughed. I smiled, but Emily didn't laugh this time. She looked at me, searching my face for a reaction I didn't give. That moment planted something. Doubt doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in quietly when a story no longer feels fully true. Behind the scenes, things were unraveling faster than Ryan knew. His partnership was strained. His timelines were unrealistic. And worst of all, he had overstated his liquidity, something that doesn't just bruise egos but attracts attention. Attention from people who don't laugh at excuses. Attention from people who expect numbers to match narratives. I didn't cause any of it. I didn't interfere. I simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of his own exaggerations. When Emily asked if I could maybe help Ryan understand something about contracts, I told her gently that Ryan didn't think I understood those things. I said it calmly, factually, and I watched the discomfort settle in her eyes. For the first time, She questioned why her husband was so confident that I knew nothing. Ryan's treatment of me worsened as pressure mounted. He became sharper, more dismissive. Arrogance often grows louder when confidence begins to crack. He spoke to me less, excluded me more openly, and leaned harder into his superiority. And still, I remained steady, because I knew something. Didn't people like Ryan don't fall because someone pushes them? They fall because they've built their lives on assumptions, and assumptions eventually collide with reality. The truth was already moving toward the surface. All I had to do was stay exactly where I was, underestimated and watching, while the structure Ryan built on ego began to show its seams. By the time the cracks in Ryan's world became visible to Emily, they were already impossible to hide. Stress has a way of changing people, not by creating new flaws, but by stripping away the polish that once concealed them. Ryan grew irritable, short-tempered, obsessed with appearances. He talked more, but said less. He repeated the same reassurances to Emily, to friends, to himself, as if volume could substitute for truth. And all the while he treated me with an edge that betrayed his fear. It was subtle, but I felt it. The dismissive jokes stopped being playful. They became defensive. A man who believes he is untouchable doesn't need to assert dominance. Man who senses the ground shifting beneath him does. Emily began calling me more often. Not for advice exactly, but for something steadier grounding. She didn't frame it that way, of course. She'd say things like, "Ryan's just under a lot of pressure," or "This is just how ambitious people are." I listened without interrupting. I didn't contradict her. I didn't criticize him. I let her talk herself through her own doubts, because that's how realization works best, when it feels like your own discovery, not someone else's accusation. Every time she spoke, I heard the distance growing between the man she married and the man she thought she knew. The first real tremor came when Ryan's minor delay turned into a formal notice. He didn't tell Emily at first. I know this because she found the letter by accident, tucked carelessly into a stack of documents he assumed she wouldn't understand. A lender, a deadline, language that doesn't exist in the world of confident speeches and vague reassurances. She called me that night, her voice shaking, asking what certain phrases meant. I explained calmly, clearly, without judgment. And in that moment, something irreversible shifted. She wasn't just hearing information, she was seeing me differently. Not as the outdated figure Ryan had painted, but as someone who understood exactly how serious the situation was. Ryan, of course, noticed the change. He noticed Emily asking more questions. He noticed her hesitating before accepting his explanations. And he noticed something else too. She was listening to me again. That realization did something to him. It made him reckless. Instead of slowing down, he doubled down. Instead of correcting course, he tried to outrun consequences. He took on more risk, made bolder claims, and in one particularly disastrous decision, he put his name and Emily's on a guarantee he had no realistic way of honoring. I found out about that not through snooping, but through a mutual contact who reached out to me quietly, assuming I was already aware. That assumption alone told me everything I needed to know about how far Ryan's constructed image of me had diverged from reality. I didn't act on the information immediately. I didn't warn him. I didn't confront Emily. I waited. Because timing in moments like these matters more than intention. The emotional shift came before the financial collapse. Emily began defending me small things at first, correcting Ryan when he dismissed me, asking him not to joke at my expense. He reacted poorly. Not violently, not explosively, but dismissively, as if her loyalty to me was a childish inconvenience. That hurt her more than any argument would have. She didn't tell me this directly, but I saw it in the way she spoke, the way her voice flattened when she talked about him. Love doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes under disrespect. Then the truth began surfacing publicly. A deal fell through. Then another. Ryan's professional circle grew quieter. Invitations slowed, calls went unanswered. The people who once laughed at his confidence started asking for documentation. Proof, clarification. The same vagueness that once made him impressive now made him dangerous. And for the first time, Ryan couldn't control the narrative. The moment he realized I was no longer invisible came unexpectedly. He asked me for help. Not directly, Ryan never asked directly, but through Emily. She approached me carefully, almost apologetically, and asked if I could look over something for them. I agreed, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. I reviewed the documents thoroughly, and then I told her the truth. Calmly, honestly, I explained the exposure. The risk, the likely outcome if nothing changed. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't soften it either. Emily cried. Not because of the numbers, but because of the realization. The man she had trusted implicitly had been operating on confidence instead of competence, and the man she had been taught to overlook had seen it coming all along. Ryan, when he learned what I'd said, was furious. He accused me of undermining him, of poisoning Emily against him, and that accusation so misplaced, so desperate, was the moment I knew everything was about to collapse. Because when truth feels like betrayal, it's only a matter of time before lies come apart. By then, I wasn't seeking vindication. I wasn't even thinking about revenge. I was watching the natural consequences of arrogance unfold. Ryan had built his authority by diminishing others. Now, with his foundation cracking, he had no one left to stand on. And the truth, quiet, documented, undeniable, was finally stepping into the light. The collapse didn't arrive with a single dramatic explosion. It came in waves, each one stripping away another layer of Ryan's carefully constructed image. First, the bank froze the line of credit he'd been relying on to keep everything afloat. Then a partner quietly exited a joint venture, citing risk exposure. Ryan still smiled in public, still spoke with confidence, but the strain had settled into his face like a permanent shadow. At home, the mask slipped more often. Emily told me later that he had begun snapping over trivial things, blaming outsiders, accusing people of jealousy, incompetence, even sabotage. What he never blamed, what he couldn't afford to blame, was himself. Emily, meanwhile, was changing in a different way. She wasn't becoming louder or angrier. She was becoming sharper. She started keeping copies of documents. She asked questions Ryan found irritating. She stopped accepting half-answers. And most importantly, she stopped letting him isolate her. From me, the more he tried to reassert control, the more obvious his insecurity became. Control, I've learned, is often the final refuge of a man who's losing respect. The breaking point came when Emily received a legal notice addressed to both of them. Not a threat yet, just a warning. A demand for clarification regarding obligations Ryan had assured her were handled. She brought it to me before she even confronted him. We sat together at my kitchen table, the same table where years earlier she'd done homework while I made her tea. I explained every line, every implication. I didn't editorialize. I didn't dramatize. I let the facts speak. And facts, unlike people, don't change their story when challenged. That night, she confronted Ryan. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. I could hear it later in her voice, the disappointment, heavier than anger. Ryan didn't deny it this time. He minimized. He deflected. He told her she was overreacting, that her father had filled her head with fear. That was his mistake. Because by then, Emily didn't need me to tell her anything. She could see it herself. And when she asked him one simple question, "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" he had no answer that didn't sound like an excuse. From that moment on, the power dynamic shifted. Ryan no longer spoke at her. He spoke around her carefully. Nervously, he knew she was watching. He knew she was no longer dependent on his version of reality. And he knew I was no longer just a background figure. I was a reference point, a contrast. Quiet competence versus loud confidence. Substance versus show. The final unraveling began when Ryan tried to cut me out entirely. He told Emily that I was interfering, that she needed to choose between her marriage and outside influence. Ultimatums are revealing things. They don't strengthen authority, they expose weakness. Emily didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply told him she needed time and left to stay with me for a few days. That decision alone did more damage to his ego than any accusation ever could. During those days, I saw the full weight of what she'd been carrying. Not just financial fear, but emotional exhaustion. She admitted she'd been defending him to herself long after the evidence had turned. Admitted she'd been afraid of what it would mean to be wrong. I listened. That's all I did. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't position myself as the savior. I just remained what I'd always been, steady, honest, present. And sometimes that's the most devastating contrast of all. Ryan's reputation, meanwhile, was unraveling faster than he could manage. Word travels quickly when confidence evaporates. Meetings were canceled. Calls went unanswered. People who once praised his vision now wanted distance from his liabilities. And in a cruel irony, the very people he'd impressed with bravado were the least forgiving when the numbers stopped working. There is no mercy in high places, only memory. When Ryan finally came to me directly, it wasn't with arrogance. It was with frustration thinly disguised as indignation. He accused me of enjoying his downfall, of plotting, of waiting for this moment. I let him speak. When he was finished, I told him something he wasn't prepared to hear, that I didn't need to do anything to him. His choices were doing enough on their own. That wasn't revenge. It was reality. And reality doesn't raise its voice. By the end of that week, Emily had made a decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but clearly. She told Ryan she wanted transparency, accountability, and time apart. He reacted exactly as someone losing. Control would anger first, then bargaining, then blame. But none of it landed. Because once respect is gone, persuasion has nowhere to stand. And as I watched it all unfold, I realized something important. This was never about humiliating Ryan. It was about the truth outlasting arrogance, about quiet dignity proving stronger than loud dismissal. The man who once treated me like a nobody was discovering that being underestimated cuts both ways. And in the silence that followed his collapse, something far more powerful than revenge was taking shape. Clarity. The end didn't come with shouting, slammed doors, or public spectacle. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, like a verdict, delivered after all the arguments had already been exhausted. By the time Emily decided to move forward with separation, Ryan was no longer fighting to win her back. He was fighting to preserve what little control he still believed he had. And that distinction mattered. When someone loves you, they try to understand. When someone needs control, they try to manage the damage. Legal proceedings began soon after. Not because Emily wanted revenge, but because clarity had become non-negotiable. Financial disclosures were requested, timelines demanded, and for the first time, Ryan was forced to put everything on paper. No charm, no improvisation, no selective truth. Documents have a way of exposing what confidence hides. The inconsistencies surfaced quickly, obligations he'd downplayed, risks he'd concealed, decisions he'd made alone while presenting them as mutual. Every page peeled back another layer. Of the man he had convinced everyone he was, I stayed in the background, exactly where I belonged. I didn't direct Emily's choices or push her toward outcomes. I supported her when she doubted herself and reminded her gently of the facts, when emotion threatened to cloud them. There is a difference between influence and support, and Ryan had never learned it. That difference, in the end, defined everything. As the process unfolded, Ryan's social circle thinned. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations became shorter, colder. People who once laughed at his jokes now watched him carefully, measuring their distance. Reputation is a fragile thing. It takes years to build and moments to fracture. And Ryan, who had once believed himself untouchable, was now learning how quickly admiration turns to avoidance when credibility disappears. The final hearing was brief. There was nothing dramatic left to argue. The truth had already done its work. Emily walked out lighter, not relieved exactly, but grounded. She hadn't won. She had reclaimed something more valuable than victory, her autonomy, her ability to trust her own judgment again. When she looked at me that day, there were no tears, just gratitude. And pride. Ryan didn't look at me when we passed in the hallway. He didn't need to. The distance between us had never been physical, it was moral. He had once dismissed me as irrelevant, as an old man whose opinions no longer mattered. And now, without a single confrontation or raised voice, He had been undone by the very things he lacked: patience, honesty, and humility. People sometimes ask if I feel satisfied. If this felt like revenge, I always give the same answer. Revenge is loud. It demands witnesses. This wasn't that. This was quieter, deeper. This was the slow, inevitable consequence of underestimating others and overestimating oneself. I didn't take anything from Ryan. I simply remained who I was while he revealed who he was. Today, Emily is rebuilding her life with intention. Not rushing, not hiding, not apologizing for needing stability and truth. We still share tea. At the same kitchen table. We talk about ordinary things, work, plans, the future. And sometimes, in the silence between words, there's an understanding that needs no explanation. As for me, I'm still the same man Ryan once ignored. Still quiet, still observant, still steady. The only difference is that now no one mistakes that for weakness, and that is how the truth came out, not with revenge, but with time.